Anyway, some time ago I had the opportunity to follow the Ganges from where it enters the plains right up to its source. And of course, the Ganges River does not have the same significance in Buddhism as it has in Hinduism. The Hindus sort of traditionally see the river as a god. And this probably derived from the fact that those who lived in the Great Plains of northern India depended upon this river for transportation, for food, and particularly for irrigation of their crops. Plus, it was a major barrier to traveling because in some parts the river is very, very wide, and also it could have a profound effect upon their lives in a negative way, because every year during the rainy season it can flood and cause great chaos and distress for the people who live there. And such devastating floods are actually mentioned by the Buddha occasionally in his discourses. But more frequently by the Buddha, the Ganges is mentioned as a simile. It's frequently used as a simile. So, for example, in one place the Buddha says, when somebody enters the monastic sangha, they lose their caste. And just as the river Ganges and other rivers flow into the sea and lose their name and become just water, so too when somebody enters the monastic sangha, they lose their caste and become just a monk. And in another place the Buddha mentions that in fact, he frequently says if something is of a great number, a great capacity, he'll say it's as countless as the Ganges, the sands in the Ganges. And in another place, I think he uses a simile where he says that just as the river Ganges slopes towards, moves towards, slides towards the east, so to somebody who does this particular type of meditation or that particular type of meditation flows towards, moves towards, goes towards nirvana and this state of freedom. So the river has that influence on Buddhism, but no spiritual influence as such. Anyway, so I began a journey up the Ganges, out of the plains and into the mountains to get to the source of the Ganges. The place where the river leaves the hills and enters the plain, there's a small town called Rishikesh, meaning the place of the rishis or the place of the ascetics. And in ancient times, this town was pretty much entirely populated by, well, I suppose in ancient time, Buddhist ascetics, but certainly for the last several thousand years by Hindu and occasionally Jain ascetics. It's considered a sort of a very significant place. And if you go there, it is actually a very interesting town. It's become rather touristy in the last few decades, but still, if you go into the hills above the town, you will find that there are rishis and that staying in caves. Anyway, I went from there and further up the Ganges, and then eventually you become to a place called Uttarakasi. So it's called Uttarakasi because it's the Kasi of the north, as it were. And anyway, this is a particularly interesting town because all of the ascetics who live in the mountains and the forests around there, they will come down to this town to get the provisions they sometimes need, and to communicate with other swamis and sadhus and sannyasis. And as you go through the town, there's quite a large population of ascetics of all particular Hindu sects there. And I had the good fortune to get to know some of them. One I found to be a really wonderful old man who'd lived in the mountains for decades. His name was Hansa Swami, the the Swan Swami, that might have been his name. Anyway, if you continue up the river, you notice that it gets, the valley gets more and more narrow, and the amount of water in the river gets less. It's nowhere near as dramatic as further down. And the countryside or the landscape is really beautiful. It is primarily forested. And I recall in one place walking through a pine forest, and on the mountain or on the cliff above me, I could see these ibis, some sort of wild goat with very big, prominent horns. And eventually one arrives in the town of Gangotri. This is a very small town which survives entirely on the visit of pilgrims. It's entirely a pilgrim town. And the most notable feature in the town is the Gangotri temple, which was built maybe 200 or 300 years ago. And at the time it was built, it was at the very end of the Gangotri glacier, the great glacier from which the water of the Ganges River comes out. Now you discover that the Gangotri glacier is nearly 25 kilometers further up the valley. In other words, in the last 200 or 300 years, the glacier has gradually retreated, probably because of changing temperatures. Just outside the town is the only waterfall on the Ganges River, which is a particularly beautiful and unusual waterfall. So I stayed in Gangotri for 2 days, and then I began I think it's about a 25 kilometer trek to the mouth of the Gangotri glacier. And when you get there, you find this vast wall of ice in which there is a huge cave, and it is from that cave that the water from the melting glacier comes out of the glacier, and that is traditionally believed to be the actual source of the Ganges. So I went to where this huge ice cave is, and I washed myself. I didn't immerse myself entirely in the water because it's cold. Actually, that's not true. It is icy cold because it is simply melted ice. Anyway, it is a very dramatic place, and there are actually some swamis who live around that very area, including some swamis, what you call aviduts. They even don't wear any clothes. Now, in the summertime, during the day, it can be quite hot, but in the nighttime, it is very, very cold, and yet they're able to endure, at least during the summer months, living at that very place. Anyway, some people go beyond Gomukh. That's what it's called, Gomukh, the mouth of the cow. That's the big glacier where the water comes out, the big cave where the water comes out. But you can walk on one side or maybe the other side of the glacier, and you can get to the very end of the glacier. So I decided to do that, to discover that this is an extremely difficult task, because as the glacier has been moving, like a what's the word? A bulldozer. As it has been moving, it piles up rocks and earth on either side of it. And to get to the end of the glacier, you have to walk over this area of about half a kilometer, maybe more than that. And there's no path, there's nothing. You've just got to make your way over shattered and broken rocks and bits of ice and what have you. And eventually you get to a place called Tapawan, which is just pools of still water and moss, and it's carpeted with green, and that's where some of the water flows into the glacier, and I assume freezes. Anyway, I'd already been told that there are 1 or 2 swamis who actually live up there. And I was given a very brief letter to one Swami whose name is Simla Swami, because he came from Simla, and he'd been living up to for many years. And I had bought some potatoes in Gangotri to offer to him, because I had been told that Simla Swami stays up there during the summer and also during the winter, and he really can't use money. What he needs is food. If he has no food, he has to go all the way down through the glacier and all the way down the valley to Gangotri to get his food, so he appreciates it if people bring food. So I went to meet him, and he was the sweetest old man who's been living up there for decades in this little hut. And we talked, and he told me that in the wintertime he just piles up the rocks in front of his little hut, and he simply meditates through the winter in his little hut, cooking his food and what have you. And it was really nice to meet a real Swami living in the Himalayas as they had done in ancient times. Anyway, just above this area of green, mossy, slightly swampy area is a very high pointed mountain called Sivaling, which Hindus, of course, believe is the largest natural lingam in the world. And you get a marvelous view of this particularly dramatic and high mountain from that area. Anyway, after spending 2 days with Simla Swami in his little hut, I then returned and then made my way back into India proper, feeling very refreshed by being in this beautiful, natural, pure, clean environment for about a week. It was a wonderful experience.